Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Henrietta's War by Joyce Dennis and then proceed to Henrietta Sees It Through, the same collections of letters continued. December 31st, 1941. My dear Robert, neither Bill nor the Linnet got home for Christmas this year, and Lady B, who always dines with us on Christmas Day, was in bed with a cold, poor darling, so Charles and I decided to give Evensong the night off and have a quiet cottage pie. On Christmas morning, I gave Charles a pair of sock suspenders, and he gave me a pair of nail scissors. We thanked each other gravely and went to our respective tasks as usual. Mattins had given herself the morning off, and people are always iller than usual on Christmas Day. Charles rushed in for lunch and rushed out again 20 minutes later with a set expression on his face. In the afternoon, I went to see Lady B, who wouldn't let me into her room because of germs. So I went back home, lit the fire in the drawing room, did the blackout all over the house, and sat down with my knitting. At 6 o'clock, there was a lot of scuffling and scrunching on the path outside, and some children began singing carols. We get a lot of carols here. Most of them squeaked hurriedly through the letterbox, but these were real carols, sung by a lot of children with a grown-up in charge. God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, they sang in their clear, sweet voices and very nearly in tune. After that, we had Once in Royal David City and Noel, Noel. A very small child came in with a collecting box, and deeply moved by their performance, I gave, as they say, generously. When Charles came home, he found me sitting in the dark, blowing my nose. "You're not getting a cold, are you?" he said rather crossly as he switched on the lights. "Hello," he said, peering at me closely. "What's going on here?" "It was the carols," I muttered. "But carols oughtn't to make you sad." "Well, these did. There's so very little peace and goodwill in the world just now, Charles." Charles patted me kindly on the shoulder. "Not the international sort, perhaps. Plenty of individual goodwill," he said. "And now go and put that cottage pie in the oven. I'm hungry." When I got back, I found Charles surrounded by a great many strange bottles. He handed me a glass of pale amber-colored liquid. "Drink that," he said. "It'll get you where you live." I took a sip. "Charles," I said, "whatever is it made of?" "Remnants," said Charles, with an airy wave of the hand toward the imposing array of bottles on the piano. "How does it taste?" "Potent, but nice." "Good. Have another." "Thank you, Charles." "You know, Henrietta," said Charles as he refilled his glass and mine, "even if we can buy the ingredients, we shall never be able to have this drink again because I can't remember how I made it. It is gone forever like the lost chord. It may be that only in heaven—" "Damn Hitler!" I said loudly. "Hear, hear," said Charles. "And the Japs, and Musso, and Laval, and God bless the King, and the Queen. Wait a minute, old girl, while I fill up my glass. Now then, and the Queen, God bless her, and the little princesses. And absent friends, Charles. Absent friends, coupled with the names of Bill and Linnet Brown," said Charles. "And the Americans." "Your glass is empty, Henrietta. May I give you a little more?" "Thank you, Charles, just a drop. I find your mixture delicious, but a trifle strong." "There you are. Now, where were we? The Americans. Good luck to them. And the Chols and the Pecks." Charles gave me a keen look. "The Poles and the Czechs, and all our other allies," he said firmly, and brought our toasting to a timely end. "I feel better," I said. "That was the idea," said Charles modestly. "A Merry Christmas, Charles." "The same to you, Henrietta." We went into dinner arm in arm, and Charles said it was the most delicious cottage pie he had ever had. Always your affectionate childhood's friend, Henrietta. And now we continue with Henrietta Sees It Through, the remainder of her war letters. February 11th, 1942. My dear Robert, is there anything more fascinating than cutting the edges of the lawn? I have an implement for doing this. I don't know its official name, but I call it the cutter, which sounds more like a ship than anything else. I keep it sharpened and wrapped in oily paper and guard it with my very life. The Linnet asked me once whether I loved my cutter more than her. I was deeply shocked by the question, but after considering the matter dispassionately for some hours, I came to the conclusion that after Charles, Linnet, Bill, Perry, and Lady B, my cutter came next, and a long way in front of Aunt Julia, Mrs. Savernack, and Cousin William. Twice a year I tenderly unwrap the cutter and slice bits off the edge of the lawn and all round the rose beds. I count these hours among the most vivid of my life. The bits that are sliced off look like delicious chocolate cake with green icing, and the gardener gathers them up greedily and hides them in the potting shed. He says they save Charles 30 shillings a year. I don't know what he uses them for. Bill says he eats them. I was engaged upon this fascinating pursuit yesterday afternoon when Lady B arrived and sat down on a garden seat in the sun to watch me. "I can't think why you grumble about gardening," she said after a few minutes. "It isn't always bliss like this," I said, pressing the cutter into the turf with a soft squelching sound. "You've left a little bulge there, Henrietta." "Here?" "Further along. Yes, that's right. I suppose I couldn't do a little bit?" "No." "I was afraid you'd say that," said Lady B so wistfully that my heart smote me. "Oh, all right," I said, grudgingly handing her the cutter. "You can do the corner." But Lady B waved it away. "I don't really want to," she said. "You go on." Not want to use the cutter? I went and sat beside her and gazed earnestly into her face. "You're not feeling ill, are you?" I said. "No," this in a very small voice. "Darling Lady B, what is it?" Lady B looked at me piteously. "It's elastic," she said. "Elastic? I suppose you realize there isn't going to be any soon? Nothing to keep our hats on with. Now that you mention it, I suppose there isn't. Nothing to keep our hats on with. Nothing to keep our stockings up with. Nothing to keep our... I mean, how else can you keep a bust bodice in place?" I sat in stunned silence. Lady B leaned towards me and said in a low voice, "And then there's stays." "Is there?" I said dully. "It's all very well for skinny people like you," said Lady B, and I knew how upset she must be to call me skinny, for she is practically the only person here who is kind enough to describe me as slim. "It doesn't matter whether you wear stays or not, but for me they are a necessity. Henrietta," she said solemnly, laying her hand on my arm, "for the last 30 years I have worn the same sort of stays. They are very expensive and very comfortable, and they have a wide piece of elastic down each side. I think I can say without undue conceit that they have proved successful for my figure. Though full, it is not in any way ungainly. In fact, there are those who have described it as neat. I never saw a neater. But from now on I shall have to stay in bed." There was a tragic silence, and I picked up the cutter and did from the top to the bottom of the south side of the lawn, thinking hard all the time. It looked a bit crooked when I'd finished, so I did it from bottom to top, but still thinking. Then I went back to the seat where Lady B was sitting gazing into an empty future, and took one of her clean hands in both my dirty ones. "Listen," I said, "I don't think it's going to be as bad as all that. You must order some new stays at once. Perhaps we shall have won the war before they are worn out. But even if we haven't, they'll probably put us on points for elastic, and you can have all mine, and Charles's, except for his braces and sock suspenders, and I really don't see why those shouldn't be knitted of wool." Lady B embraced me tenderly. "I knew you'd cheer me up," she said. Then we heard feet on the gravel, and Mrs. Savernack came round the corner. "No wonder the Russians think we aren't working hard enough," she said grimly, and I got guiltily to my feet. "We were talking about my stays," said Lady B, who was now quite cheerful again. "Stays? Pah!" said Mrs. Savernack. "You'd be a great deal better if you didn't wear them." "And you'd be a—" I began, but Lady B gently but very firmly pressed my foot and shook her head at me. Mrs. Savernack picked up my cutter and ran an appreciative thumb around its edge. "Nice implement," she said. "I'll finish this job for you." "Oh, please don't bother, Mrs. Savernack," I cried. But Mrs. Savernack, ignoring me, was squinting along the edge of the lawn which I had just done. "My dear Henrietta," she said, "this is frightfully crooked." And she started a new line of her own, while I pranced beside her, uttering little cries of frustration and distress. Lady B remarked that our lawn was looking much smaller than it used to. "There you are," said Mrs. Savernack, and she handed me back the cutter, which I grasped feverishly in my arms like a mother receiving back her child from the hands of strangers. Then she stood on the rake, which flew up and hit the back of her head, but Lady B's eye was upon me, and I never smiled. Always your affectionate childhood's friend, Henrietta. February 25th, 1942. My dear Robert, whenever we meet visitors, they say to us, "And how does your British restaurant work down here?" "There isn't one," we reply, hanging our heads. "What, no British restaurant?" they cry, looking at us askance as though we were West Country quislings. "What you all need is a stick of bombs to wake you up." Those people here whose homes have actually been destroyed by bombs, or who have suffered loss and anxiety on account of the war, take these remarks very much to heart, and at last feeling ran so high that it was decided to hold a public meeting and discuss the subject thoroughly. We always hold our meetings here at 7:30, which is the hour when Charles staggers into his home with a white face, demanding whiskey and a hot meal, and likes to find his wife sitting by the fire mending his pajamas. Bill and the Linnets say that to complete the picture, I ought to be rocking a cradle with my foot, but when they repeated this to Charles, he shuddered and said, "God forbid." When I arrived at the meeting at 7:35, having left an apologetic note for Charles propped against the whiskey decanter, the hall was nearly full. Lady B was there representing the Women's Institute, Mrs. Savernack representing the Miniature Rifle Club, Mrs. Whinebite, the Mothers' Union, Admiral Marsden, the Urban District Council, Colonel Simpkins, the Specials, Faith, the ARP, and the conductor, the Women's Choir. I could tell a lot of other people were representing other things, too, by the solemn expressions on their faces. The WVS, representing the WVS, made a nice green patch in the middle of the hall. My neighbor whispered to me that their uniform had been designed by a famous couturier, but be that as it may, it is certainly nice and proves once for all that uniforms can be becoming as well as serviceable. At 8:20, the Admiral opened the proceedings by saying that the meeting had been called with a view to discussing the possibility of starting a British restaurant. Then he sat down, and there was a long and embarrassing silence. At the end of 5 minutes, little Mrs. Simpkins, unable to bear it any longer, pretended her nose was bleeding and left the hall. Then Lady B stood up amid a burst of hysterical cheering and said she thought a British restaurant would be a good idea, whereupon Mrs. Savernack jumped to her feet and said Lady B was one of her oldest friends, and she was sorry to contradict her in public, but that she, Mrs. Savernack, was quite sure it would not be a good idea, especially if it were true that the rifle range was going to be taken over as a kitchen. The Admiral said the point was who would run it. All eyes were turned on the WVS. Eyes always are turned on the WVS when somebody asks this sort of question. I sometimes wonder if they get tired of it. The head WVS rose to say that they had a scheme worked out already to be put into use. Faith said Lord Woolton had told us that it was a way in which we might augment our rations. I said I would be very glad to augment our rations when the Linnet came home for her day off. Mrs. Whinebite turned on me and with blazing eyes asked if I realized that it would mean the breakup of home life. And I said, why? Everybody became very angry. It had been a long and trying winter, and all the pent-up irritations of months were suddenly let loose. Shouts were heard, fists were shaken, and people who till then hadn't cared a hoot whether they had a British restaurant or not found themselves fighting passionately on one side or the other. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," said the Admiral. "It's nothing but a ramp to deprive the poor tradesman of his due. The wrong people would use it. I'm sure I don't want a British restaurant. If you had no maids and 3 evacuees instead of a paying guest at 4 guineas a week, you might. Women ought to learn to shoot instead of cooking. I know the sanctity of the home means nothing to bohemians like you, Mrs. Brown," said Mrs. Whinebite, who seemed to hold me responsible for the whole thing. "Henrietta is not a bohemian." "Yes, I am." "Ladies and gentlemen, please." A little man who had been standing by the platform holding up his hand for at least 5 minutes suddenly commanded silence. "I think it is only fair to inform the meeting," he said, "that the Chamber of Commerce has voted unanimously against a British restaurant." After that, we all went home quietly because, of course, it's not the slightest good trying to run a restaurant without the cooperation of the tradesmen. Next morning in the street, I saw a vaguely familiar face smiling at me. "Hello, Mrs. Brown. How nice to see you down here again," I said. This is what I always say to visitors while I am trying to remember their names. "You remember my arm?" "Of course. My doctor was absolutely astonished at the result. He said he couldn't have done it better himself. You might tell Dr. Brown." "I will." "Well, how are you getting on? Of course, one simply wouldn't know there was a war on down here." "Wouldn't one?" "How is your British restaurant working?" "Look," I said, "there's Lady B. You remember Lady B, don't you?" "Why, yes," cried the visitor, and dived across the road, while I slipped into the chemist's to have a little chat about soap. Always your affectionate childhood's friend, Henrietta. March 11th, 1942. My dear Robert, Faith has resigned from the ARP and joined the WAAFs. She said she simply couldn't bear reading about Germany's stupendous preparations for their spring offensive and go on living more or less comfortably at home any longer. We all think this is a tremendous gesture on her part because, of course, she isn't as young as she was and has always lived a rather luxurious sort of life. The conductor, naturally, is distraught and is moving heaven and earth to get into the Air Force, where he hasn't the faintest chance of doing. Faith was rather worried about her little WAAF hat at first. She said it was years since she had worn a hat really on her head, but she has got used to it now, and the result is a fair treat. Lady B and I are wildly jealous. We, too, have guilty feelings about living in our homes, and last week Lady B went and offered hers to the ATS. "I'm 75, she said, "and I know you are thinking I would look ridiculous in uniform. But I'm perfectly healthy, good-tempered, and amenable to discipline. I'm not suggesting I should harness myself to a gun and pull it up hills, but I am suggesting that I might sit in a hostel and do the mending and catering, and keep a motherly eye on the girls. I like girls. I've had 2 daughters of my own, and I know how to talk to them." The ATS shook their heads sadly. "All you say is perfectly true," they said, "except about you looking ridiculous in uniform, because we think you'd look very nice." Lady B said afterwards it must be true about the recruiting officers being chosen for their tact. "We'd love to have you, but the age limit is 45, you know." Lady B bumbled sadly back in the bus and called in at our house on the way home for comfort. Charles was so sorry for her that he gave her a glass of our last bottle of sherry, which Lady B accepted without demur, and that shows how low her spirits were. "Personally, I'm delighted that you were turned down," said Charles, handing her a glass, "though I think they were fools not to jump at you. You'd be worth your not inconsiderable weight in gold in any hostel, Lady B, darling. But personally, I feel that this war is quite dreary enough down here without having you taken away from us." "Dear Charles," said Lady B. "Look at Henrietta brooding away in that chair," said Charles. "I know exactly what she's going to say." "What?" said I. "That you want to go and make munitions." "Well, I do." "Okay," said Charles, "just find a woman to come and live in this house who's prepared to do the housekeeping and look after me without getting on my nerves, and cook when evensong is out, and fuss over Bill and the linnet when they come home, and not mind if I don't speak when I'm tired, and do 2 hours in the garden every afternoon, and all without pay. Then you can go and get ill in a munitions factory whenever you like." Charles recklessly poured himself a second glass of sherry and tossed it off. There was a long silence, and then suddenly, like a blinding flash, a thought came into my head. "Lady B," I said. Lady B and Charles stared at each other. Then Charles said in an awed excuse me. "Lady B," I said. Lady B and Charles stared at each other. Then Charles said in an awed voice, "I can't imagine anything nicer." "Nor can I," said Lady B, and flew, as they say, into his arms, and was folded into his breast. I hope you won't mind if I come home on leave sometimes," I said bitterly. But Lady B was frowning and pushing Charles away from her. "Charles," she said, "I couldn't manage the garden. I'm a strong, healthy woman, but I could not do 2 hours gardening every afternoon." Charles looked at me doubtfully. "Perhaps I'd better keep her," he said, as though I were a newborn kitten. So here I am, Robert, still in the old home and practicing the negative virtues of the wartime housekeeper. I'd rather be making munitions. I have had a present. 2 pairs of real silk stockings from Ceylon. When I opened the parcel, I nearly fainted. They were so lovely I couldn't make up my mind to wear them, and the linnet began to inquire about them in a very meaning sort of way, so that I took them out of my stocking drawer and locked them away in my desk for safety. Then one day I did wear them. I always thought they would make their debut at Bill's or the linnet's wedding, or possibly the peace celebrations, but I actually wore them on the day our boiler burst, because by 7:30 p.m., with no drink in the house, civilian morale was running distinctly low, and silk stockings seemed the only things that could possibly raise it. Oh, the lovely, smooth, silky sheen of those stockings! I don't care what anybody says, Leal thread never gave a woman leg assurance yet. When Charles came home, he found me swooning in an ecstasy. Look, Charles, look at my lovely stockings. Very nice. Your legs are your only claim to beauty, Henrietta. But they're real silk, Charles. Take care you don't get a ladder, said Charles in a killjoy sort of way. Don't be silly, Charles, I said. How could I get a ladder just sitting in a chair? In the middle of dinner, I laid down my knife and fork and stared across the table. What's the matter? Said Charles. Have you got a pain? Something had gone ping at my knee and then run down my shin like the stroking of a gentle finger. But I had had my hour. Always your affectionate childhood's friend, Henrietta. And we will continue her saga next time.